So the New Zealanders fighting with every fibre of their being.
Hang on to it, New Zealand.
Hang on to it, New Zealand. It's over. History has been made. The players are exhausted. They're on the deck. What a great game we've seen. The New Zealand side have claimed this moment as their time for the history books. And as you can see, they've played themselves literally into the ground.
I think a lot of old All Blacks, whatever they might have thought about the relationship with South Africa, watched that with a certain amount of satisfaction, and Sean Fitzpatrick bashing to ground at the end. We all did the same with him.
To understand the emotion, you have to know the history. It took nearly 70 years for New Zealand to win that first Test series on South African soil. For most of that long time, whichever side was on top would call itself the champion of the rugby world. So this is the story of a long and great sporting rivalry. It's also the story of prejudice, of how the politics of race brought the contest to a standstill under the harsh light of international condemnation. None of this would have happened if rugby people in both countries had not been driven by one abiding passion: to beat the All Blacks or to beat the mighty Springboks.
I had two dreams really as a rugby player. I really was one to be an All Black, and the other one was to play South Africa.
You know, when I started to play for South Africa, the ultimate was to play the All Blacks. That was the ultimate thing, you know. Even if you get one game against the All Blacks, it was really something special.
You know, playing against the All Blacks is really something great for a Springbok player. And I think the same goes for them.
They had passion that Wales didn't have, Australia didn't have. They had greater passion than us. And all the stuff I'd been told, I lived and I was brought up as a kid to fear the box.
The British may have invented the game, but in 1905, the All Blacks toured there and showed them how to play it, laying claim to being the best side in the world. The Springboks then did much the same and staked their own claim to the world title.
Almost like a virility contest. And that's how the relationship between New Zealand and South Africa developed. Settler societies, given a chance, given a game almost on a plate. Here is a game that you can take and use your raw strength and your, if you like, your pioneering anger, and turn it into something which you can beat the British at. It was almost subliminal in a way, but it was a game which enabled us to express ourselves physically.
But this physical game was also a political game. South Africa made their first tour to New Zealand in 1921. On the rugby field, the two sides were closely matched, the All Blacks winning the first test, the Boks the second. And with a draw in the third and final test, honours were even. The question of race may never have arisen on this tour if not for a South African reporter by the name of Charles Blackett. After the match between the Springboks and New Zealand Maori, Blackett sent a telegram home that so offended the local postmaster that he leaked it to the press. The offending telegram reads, "Bad enough having to play team officially designated New Zealand natives, but spectacle thousands of Europeans frantically cheering on band of coloured men to defeat members of own race was too much for Springboks, who frankly disgusted."
That telegram caused a huge amount of trouble. And what is interesting, there was a fellow called Tokkie Scholz. Now, he was a good Afrikaans boy on this tour. And he writes home about that match, not knowing about what Blackett had done, saying what fine sportsmen they were, the Maoris that they played against. So I think it was one silly man, perhaps. And yet you don't know, perhaps he represented a wider feeling, I don't know.
7 years later, the All Blacks made their first official tour of South Africa. The team included 9 members of the outstanding Invincibles side of 1924. But there were 2 notable omissions: halfback Jimmy Mill and his Invincibles teammate, star fullback George Napier, who were ineligible because of their Maori blood. Their absence hardly caused a stir in New Zealand.
I think the attitude of the New Zealand Union and also of what was then called the Maori Advisory Board was that they didn't want to put Maori at risk in South Africa, which is why they didn't choose them. They felt, rightly or wrongly, they felt that they were doing the best thing by people such as George Napier and Jimmy Mill in 1928 by not sending them there.
On the rugby field, the All Blacks were crushed 17-0 in the first test, still their biggest losing margin against the Springboks. But they won 2 of the remaining 3 tests, and once again honours were even, and the World Rugby crown was still up for grabs. The one surviving player from those tests, 99-year-old South African George Daniel, remembers the drawn series as a fair outcome.
As far as we're concerned, it was a very good result. The fact that we won 2 and they won 2, we felt that was just about how things were.
The 1930s proved to be a golden era for Springbok rugby. By the time the team arrived in New Zealand in 1937, they had already won their 2nd Grand Slam in the UK and had easily accounted for the Australians. They expected to win. After convincing displays in the provincial games, the supremely confident Boks surprisingly lost the first test before turning things round in the second and squaring the ledger.
White pass goes astray, but Bessa picks it up and goes over to score.
The stage was set for the decider in Auckland. The star player of this test would turn out to be Springbok centre Louis Babro, although there was a brief moment when he thought his Jewish faith might have kept him on the sideline.
It was a Jewish holiday. In fact, it was quite amusing. I went to Philip Nell and I said, Philip, somebody's just told me that it's a holiday and that I shouldn't play. And he just said, bugger off, man. You're not here on a religious crusade. You're here to play rugby, and that's how it ended.
Lochner breaks away, runs down to Taylor, sends to Babro, and Babro has a run in, scoring a try after the game has been in progress 6 minutes.
Babro went on to score 2 tries in a Springbok victory that stunned the All Blacks and the whole of New Zealand.
We scored 5 tries. We could have scored, I think, 8. I don't think we'll ever see a perfectly executed game as I saw that day. I don't think ever.
The 1949 tour of South Africa was the All Blacks' first real tour in over a decade. Once again, players like the great midfielder Johnny Smith were not permitted to travel because of the colour of their skin. In South Africa, racism was no longer just a state of mind, it was law.
Not only did they legalise it, but they took it to all its logical extremes, saying these people are different, therefore they should be separated. Therefore, they should be separated at everything. You must be born separately, schooled separately, buried separately, you play separately, you're not allowed to marry each other, the Mixed Marriages Act came in. All of that, having decided they were separate and should be separate, they wanted to separate the whole thing. I mean, it became bizarre, and really a form of madness.
The All Black side had actually been picked 8 months before embarking on the long sea voyage to South Africa. Once docked in Cape Town, they were vigorously entertained by their hosts. Weight and lack of fitness became a problem. The other major obstacle facing the All Blacks was a good Springbok side with a great kicker. Goal-kicking prop forward Ockie Geffen was to prove the All Blacks' nemesis.
Ockie Geffen steadies himself. He kicks high and straight, it's over, and South Africa leads 3-0.
While Geffen was on target, All Black Bob Scott was struggling.
Scott kicks, but misses by a narrow margin.
Goal kicking was pretty vital, and maybe if I'd have kicked, 80 or 90%, it probably might have made a difference in the tests. I don't know, but the pressure was on the goal kickers.
This was a likely 3-point start, but Scott, whose kicking form has disappointed throughout the tour, missed narrowly.
Despite scoring more tries than the Boks, the All Blacks lost the series 4-0. Questions have since been raised about the local refs' impartiality, but the All Black fullback still holds himself responsible.
No, I was pretty despondent, I was pretty depressed, and I've never ever forgotten it. Live with me forever. And, for all the praise and all the things that have ever been said, it never erases the feelings of that tour.
After the shame of 1937 and the whitewash of 49, the New Zealand rugby public was out in force to greet the Springboks when they returned to New Zealand in 1956.
I, of course, realize that we are here in a country where the main export product is rugby, because women, children, and men, they all were there, all the families, and so friendly.
Friendly, perhaps, but this was a New Zealand public desperate for revenge.
The air in New Zealand, the atmosphere in New Zealand was that of a crusade, a campaign. You know, as George Orwell said, it was war without the guns. But the whole of New Zealand, it seemed, wanted to beat these South Africans. A, because we'd never beaten them in a series. B, because they were here. C, because they were South Africans.
The New Zealand rugby public got what they wanted in the first test at Carisbrook. This Ron Jardine intercept try sealed a victory for the home side by 10 points to 6.
And he's off down the sideline for a magnificent and historic individual try.
But despite the victory, there were ominous signs for the All Blacks. The Springboks had dominated many of the exchanges, especially in the forwards. In the second test, the Boks not only beat the All Blacks, they beat them up.
Patrick is tackled by White. He tosses White and tramps on him. In the middle of the paddock, Ray staggers from a kick in the head that the crowd on both the stand and the Western Bank think is unnecessary. For the next ruck, Ray is back in the thick of things and still taking a pounding.
This will be remembered as one of the most brutal matches ever played between the two sides. The Boks won 8-3, and again their forwards completely overpowered the All Blacks. Sweeping changes were demanded for the third test, and the selectors decided to bring back one of the hard men of New Zealand rugby.
I thought, now, if we're going to be intimidated, we're going to get done. I had to develop an attitude that says, no, we're not going to get intimidated. And the guys got behind me. That was good. I enjoyed that.
The South African theory is that they picked this retired ex-boxer called Skinner and said to him, go and punch these fellas.
In the third test, debutant fullback Don Clark was instantly on target with what would become a legendary boot. The recalled Peter Jones also made a huge impression. When Tiny White went over in the last minute, the All Blacks had secured a famous victory by 17 points to 10. There's no doubt Skinner had added steel to the All Black pack. His fiery exchanges with Chris Cock and Jaap Becker are now part of rugby folklore. Becker's battered face says much about Skinner's no-nonsense approach to the game.
Skinner, he was of some nuisance value for the All Blacks and for us. I don't want to go into detail there, but if that should happen today, what happened there that day, Skinner would get 10 red cards.
On-field controversies aside, the 56 Springboks proved to be immensely popular and welcomed tourists. On the surface at least, the politics of race was virtually a non-issue. Eden Park was packed to the gunnels for the deciding test, and the whole nation held their collective breath. Don Clark was again on target, and when Peter Jones sprinted over for this spectacular try, the All Blacks sealed their first series win over the Boks.
Wonderful and decisive try.
While the whole of New Zealand went into raptures, South Africa were left contemplating their first series defeat in 60 years. It was their turn to question the refereeing.
People told us, you know, that long before we arrived in New Zealand, the referees, the coaching fraternity, the rugby fraternity, they was planning to beat us, and they did succeed.
In 1960, the New Zealand Rugby Union reaffirmed its policy of excluding Maori players for the upcoming tour to South Africa. The New Zealand government chose not to intervene, and public protest grew rapidly. But as the All Blacks got ready to depart, the union was at pains to assure their South African counterparts the side was leaving with the best wishes of most New Zealanders.
Sometimes you would have heard in your papers over there some controversy concerning this tour, but I would want you to know that it goes with the best wishes of the vast majority of the people of New Zealand and all the rugby playing people, particularly our Maori rugby players.
But it seems not all Maori rugby players shared the union's sentiment.
At the inaugural meeting of the Citizens All Black Tour Association, the organisation that spearheaded the opposition to the tour, a telegram was received from George Napier that said simply, "Best of luck, let me know if you need a fullback."
As the team flew out under protest, even some South Africans believed the New Zealand government should have made a stand.
Many people in this country felt the New Zealand government was at fault. They should have insisted that the best team has come to South Africa, and that did not occur. And well, at that stage we had a nationalist, United Party government. You could do nothing about it. Racism in this country was rife.
A bad pass from Briscoe to Nesbitt, who misses. Lideen gathers and sends Laidlaw through the gap. He gives a short...
Despite having no Maori players, the 1960 All Black side was a strong one. Going into the fourth test, the series was locked up one apiece with one test drawn. But once again, the South Africans prevailed on their home turf. And once again, hometown refs were cause for much frustration.
You know, the series could have been won, so it wasn't so much of a shock. We had a good team, they had referees.
When the 65 Springboks touched down in New Zealand, South African rugby supremo Dani Craven was well aware that growing anti-apartheid protest in this country meant the next All Black touring side to South Africa would be selected on merit, not race. Craven was confident this could be achieved.
Craven went out there believing fully that he had government permission for Maoris to come in the 67 All Black team. So he went out there and he negotiated with New Zealand on those terms and made no bones about his feelings.
The All Black forwards have the last say.
But the 65 tour would not prove to be a happy one for the South African rugby boss. On the field, his team came up against a legendary All Black pack and lost the first two tests. A spirited comeback saw them peg one back in the third test. But on the eve of the fourth, the South African president made a decision that would dash Craven's dream of a racially mixed All Black side visiting South Africa in 1967.
The night before the game, Verwoerd had a meeting of the Nationalist Party youth at a place called Loskop Dam in the northern Transvaal, in which he made no bones about it that Maoris would not be welcome. And his Nationalist Party faithful all said, "Here, here," and clapped their hands. And so the tour was off. They knew the tour was off.
As Barnard seizes him, he passes to Rummy.
The fourth test would prove to be one of the truly great All Black performances. The home side winning by a record margin of 20 points to 3. Once again, New Zealand could celebrate a series win over the Boks. But as the players linked arms, behind the scenes officials realised that tours of South Africa by the All Blacks were now suspended indefinitely. In 1970, new South African President John Vorster opened the door for a mixed-race All Black side to tour. The All Black selectors chose 4 players of Pacific Island or Maori blood, but their inclusion did nothing to appease the anti-apartheid activists in New Zealand.
As an anti-apartheid movement, we're opposed to sporting contact with South Africa because of the way South Africa treated its own black population, and the fact that it would allow 4 people into South Africa who were of Maori or Pacific Island origin was absolutely irrelevant.
All Black strongman Ken Gray agreed and declined to travel to South Africa. Other All Blacks thought long and hard about their decision to tour.
The opportunity offered in 1970, so long as we could go with our multiracial team, once that precedent had been created, I felt on balance that it was worth this. And people that I knew in South Africa and who were liberals there encouraged us to come.
The tour itself had a familiar ring to New Zealand supporters.
Williams. That is a great try in anyone's language.
Despite an outstanding try by Brian Williams on debut, the All Blacks lost the first test 17-6. It was their first loss in 5 years. The All Blacks won the second and lost the third. This Brian Williams try in the fourth gave the tourists a sniff at tying the series.
And he's going to score right under the posts. A great try.
But All Black errors at crucial times cost them.
The extra man with Dick outside of him.
Once again, under the cloud of partisan home refs, the South Africans were victorious. In 1972, Prime Minister Norman Kirk put a halt to a proposed tour to New Zealand by the Springboks, the first time the government had intervened on such matters. But in the 1975 election campaign, Nationals' Robert Muldoon made it clear he had no intention of intervening with sporting matters if elected. His stance struck a chord, especially with rural New Zealand, and contributed in no small way to his party's landslide victory.
I was born in this country, I was brought up in this country. I know the ordinary bloke in this country, doesn't matter where he comes from or what he is. He wants someone to talk to him simply, honestly, put the issues to him, good or bad, and he'll make his own decision.
I think what the election in 1975 showed was that whilst the anti-apartheid movement had made significant progress since 1970 in terms of winning support from people throughout the country, there was still a very sizable, vocal, determined lobby that said these sorts of contacts should continue.
But there was also a growing international lobby saying they shouldn't. Abraham Ordia, president of the Supreme Council for Sport in Africa, made it very clear that the Montreal Olympics were at risk of a black African boycott if the proposed 76 All Black tour of South Africa went ahead.
I was in London early in 1976, and Abraham Ordia was in London, and he said to me that if the All Blacks went to South Africa that year, they would boycott the Olympics. And I laughed and I said, you know, who's going to support you? I mean, you know, countries are not going to stay away from the Olympics because of a rugby team being in South Africa. And he says, you watch.
La Nouvelle-Zélande. New Zealand.
The New Zealand team marched into the Montreal Olympic Stadium in 1976, but some 30 African countries didn't. The boycott threat was real, and New Zealand faced international condemnation.
I thought it was utterly selfish. That was an unkind act to Canada and to the Commonwealth. And they were impervious to those considerations, and ultimately, of course, such a large number of African countries boycotted the Montreal Olympics and led us down a path which was, you know, pretty disastrous.
I don't think the New Zealand Union understood the depth of international feeling at the time. They were sincere men, honest men, naive perhaps.
The tour that had caused such international controversy was not a happy one for the All Blacks. The tourists lost the series 3-1, and years of grumblings about biased South African refs came to a head. The most controversial decision took place in the final test.
Kevin Everly. Bruce Robertson, has he got the pace? Bruce Robertson. Ian Robertson. And the number 12, Oosthuizen, took Robertson out of the play, and Kirkpatrick demands that it should be a penalty try, but it's only a penalty for the All Blacks.
Bruce Robertson was clearly obstructed when about to score a try. Justified demands for a penalty try were turned down. With the final score 15-14 in favour of the Boks, it did make a difference.
And the match is over.
Even some South African officials conceded the All Blacks had been robbed.
Referees get things wrong, and perhaps he got it wrong. Perhaps he should have given a penalty try, not a penalty. Craven thought he should have given a penalty try. All of New Zealand thought he should have given a penalty try.
By 1980, there were signs of change in South African rugby, however much they were branded as window dressing by South Africa's many foes. Errol Tobias had become the first coloured player to represent the Springboks, and the New Zealand Union thought the climate sufficiently changed to invite the Springboks to tour in 1981. The Muldoon government once more refused to intervene. The All Blacks were without two key players. Centre Bruce Robertson and their captain Graham Murray made themselves unavailable on moral grounds.
I think probably to make the decision in the first place, you've probably got to believe that the cause was a valid one, and I mean, I certainly don't think many New Zealanders condoned apartheid, but I think the other part of it to me, and probably the major part, was that the tour was in New Zealand, and that I felt it would be really bad for the game of rugby, and that it would be bad for New Zealand.
You asked me in 81, if in hindsight, if I'd known what was going to happen, I probably wouldn't have played against them. But at the time I had a choice. There's a democratic right to choose who you want to do, play against who you want to do, who I vote for. Now, I made the choice. Two of my best mates didn't. Graham Murray and Bruce Robertson. Still my best mates. You know, soul brothers. Friends for life. They made their choice. They didn't. I didn't say anything to them. I made my choice. They wished me best of luck. They didn't throw their views on apartheid down me. I made my choice to play with them as a footy player. They made their choice as a footy player not to play against them. So what? That's what we live in, isn't it? It's not a commie state.
New Zealand may not have been a communist state, but it was about to resemble something like a police state. When protesters stormed the pitch at the Springbok Waikato game, New Zealand was about to be divided like never before.
Sorry to have to make the announcement, but the game has been officially cancelled.
As supporters vented their anger and the protesters held their ground, a worried Springbok manager contemplated calling the tour off.
That night, I gave it a thought, and I phoned Dr. Craven, the president, and I said to him, "Hell, you know, it's getting difficult now." And so he also advised me, stay. He asked me what Alsace Blazy said, and I said to him, stay. So we stayed.
They look like they're going to come. We get steady.
The tour continued. The police drew batons, and the protesters grew in numbers and determination.
Even I was surprised by the level of opposition to the 1981 tour. The level of the opposition, the intensity of the opposition, the absolutely determined nature of that opposition to the tour was something that I certainly wasn't confident that it would be like that before the tour began.
Police and protesters were out in force before the first test in Christchurch. The Springboks had been camped out in squash courts the night before. Hardly the perfect build-up.
60 metres.
Things got no better for them when the game actually started.
Mixted nearly got it. Ken Stewart has it to Shaw, to Mixted. Thrown down right on the line. Mark Shaw.
The All Blacks comprehensively outplayed the Springboks in the first test, outscoring them by 3 tries to 1. But as often the case in test series between the great rivals, the tourists came back to win just as convincingly in the second.
The defence is across. Oh, that's a fine try. And Hermesay signals his return with a great try in the corner.
The stage was set for a climactic final test at Eden Park. But there would also be a climactic finale fought out between the police and protesters. The bloody skirmishes shocked television audiences around the world.
This is our day! We are going to defeat this racist test!
With a low-flying plane dropping flower bombs onto the field, no test has ever been played in more bizarre circumstances. The game itself was also an epic battle.
Wilson pulls it down. That's right. Next steady, nearly got across. Knock on there, but a try.
With the All Blacks comfortably ahead, the Springboks rallied and set about trying to pull off one of the great comebacks.
Come on, and now to chase here. Mort and Hewson, and I think Mort got there first. Mort did get there. It's got to be a try. A converted try to win, a try to draw. Morta, he's got the bounce. Mort, that's the try! 22-all!
The Springboks had tied the game, but in the last minute, the All Blacks were awarded a controversial penalty.
So 5 minutes into injury time, Alan Hewson has a chance to win the series for New Zealand. And he's done it!
As dramatic as Alan Hewson's last-minute series-winning penalty was, the real drama had taken place off the field. The battles between protesters, police and rugby fans had changed New Zealand forever. But more importantly, it also helped South Africa to change. If some of the players and management had not truly appreciated the level of international opposition to their government's apartheid policies before the tour, they did now.
Looking back now, and I think if you ask the players too, they would tell you that this apartheid policy of ours has served its time, and it was now something of the past.
In 1985, the New Zealand Rugby Union had again hoped to tour South Africa. But two Auckland lawyers, Patrick Finnegan and Phil Recordon, argued the tour would be in breach of the union's own constitution.
And of course it came to be the big issue, and a couple of smart-ass lawyers takes them to court on the grounds that it is not in the interests of the game, and win.
A year later, a number of All Blacks were invited to make an unofficial tour of South Africa, this time without the union's blessing. The Cavaliers won just one game against the Springboks and lost 3. These results don't belong in the official record books and mean little.
I don't think there was much interest in the tour, really. I don't know if it was... Oh, yeah, some of the matches were shown on television. But it's a tour that I look back on now with just utter indifference. It's an irrelevance in terms of rugby to me.
Isolation and sanctions had driven not only rugby, but all of South Africa deeper into crisis. The only solution, at first unpalatable to the Afrikaner, was to begin negotiating with black majority leaders. Groups like the ANC were still branded terrorists by the ruling National Party. But a trickle of exploratory contact grew to a groundswell for change, and rugby thinkers began to explore the road to integration. It was perhaps appropriate that a New Zealander and a rugby player should play a hand in this change. Chris Laidlaw was the New Zealand consulate in Zimbabwe when he was asked to broker a meeting between the two factions.
We did manage to persuade the ANC to meet with Louis Late and Dani Craven in Harare. And it worked out. Up they came. Louis Late came up full of enthusiasm. Where are these ANC fellas? I've been hoping to get to grips with them for years. He said, we never see them. I didn't know they existed. Anyway, they were. And they hammered out an arrangement whereby the South African system itself would be desegregated. And whatever you might think about Louis Late, and New Zealanders have very strong emotional feelings about the man, I can tell you that he contributed very substantially to this process.
Negotiations accelerated after Prime Minister F.W. de Klerk announced in early 1990 the lifting of the ban on the ANC and other opposition groups. Shortly afterwards, the whole world could see the pace of change when de Klerk released ANC leader Nelson Mandela. By 1992, the rugby world was ready to welcome South Africa back into the fold. And the honour of the first test went to the old enemy, New Zealand.
I was captain when we sort of got back into international rugby, and it was, I think, more appropriate playing the first game against New Zealand than anybody else.
The test was played only 2 months after 43 ANC supporters had been massacred. The ANC considered reinstating the sporting moratorium, but relented on the condition a minute's silence be observed and the old apartheid anthem not be played.
60-second silence.
But the silence is not silent, and the anthem is played. Rugby was struggling to move on. The game itself lived up to all expectations, and the All Blacks soon showed the Springboks that isolation had done their rugby no favours.
Quick clap taken by Zinzambrook, and there's a try for the All Blacks. Up to Bunce straight through. Now looking out wide for Kerwin, but he's being hounded. Great pass to Kerwin, and Kerwin underneath the crossbar.
By the time John Timu had scored the All Blacks' third try, the game was never in doubt. Springbok pride had taken a battering.
Instant replay.
They expected to win. Yes, it was a rude, abrupt awakening.
By 1994, Nelson Mandela had swept to power in South Africa's first free election. 1 year later, they hosted the third Rugby World Cup. The dissension that existed in '92 had seemed to have disappeared under Mandela's leadership, and it was a united Rainbow Nation that fronted the All Blacks in the final.
Stransky, he's having the drop kick. He's written his name across rugby history, perhaps.
New Zealanders will forever remember the illness that affected the majority of the All Black team that day.
New Zealand 12.
But in the final analysis, and despite the heartbreak to New Zealanders, the Springbok victory in extra time ensured a fairy tale ending for a unified South Africa.
It's over. Triumph for the Rainbow Nation. It's the world in union. The world as one.
When Nelson Mandela, you know, in his number 6 jersey, and he thanked Pienaar, and Pienaar said, "No, we owe you the thanks." And then the television reporter David van der Sant said to him, "What's it like to have 63,000 people behind you?" Which was Ellis Park's crowd. He said, "It wasn't 63,000, it was 43 million." Yeah.
A year later, the All Blacks had a chance to avenge the World Cup defeat. As the team ran out onto Loftus Versfeld in Pretoria on the 24th of August 1996, they were just one win away from history. Win this one, and the last great monkey would be off the All Black back. A first ever series win in South Africa. But things didn't start well for the visitors.
try. I think you'll find it's gone to Hannes Straden, number 4. Marshall. This is another good run by the brave Canterbury halfback. He's got Ian Jones with him. He gives it instead to Robin Brooke, and now to Ian Jones, to Wilson. What a super try. Right around behind the posts, a great try. Suzanne Brooke to Marshall. Cullen up Wilson. Good chase here by Wilson. He's got the bounce. That's 2 for Wilson. It's there for Marshall. Are they going to have the drop kick? Suzanne Brooke is trying to put the game beyond doubt, and he's done it. He's done it. Suzanne Brooke and the New Zealand team have seized the moment to write a page across All Black rugby history.
After 1996, rugby between the All Blacks and South Africa ran to a new pattern, the pattern of tri-nations professional rugby. More money, more tests, more tries, but in the eyes of many, less memorable.
Full pass by Brent Russell and Rocket. Thoko's going to score. Can you believe it?
The Tri-Nations is all a bit ho-hum, here we go again sort of stuff. And I know it still rates well on television, and I know grounds are still full. But that's just the power of rugby, I think.
There's no doubt professional rugby has changed the dynamic of All Black South Africa tests. For many purists, there's only one way to put the heat back into this once great rivalry.
And the All Blacks are in again under the bar.
I'm only sorry that New Zealand don't tour here and play the provinces and have their old-fashioned tour, just for once.
You know, even if they could somehow shorten tours, you know, where we come over here and maybe it's just a 3-match test series with a lot less provincial games, but they get over and get that tradition going again, it would be fantastic. But now with the professional era, I'm not sure if that will happen again.
To go away on tours for 4.5 months with men of your own age and you know, common interests and just wanting to play rugby and enjoy, it was an experience that money can't buy that.
The nostalgic cry for a return to tours will no doubt help rekindle the old rivalry. But sadly, the two nations no longer vie for the title of best rugby team in the world. South Africa in particular has struggled in recent times.
And I believe if South Africa or New Zealand aren't in the top 3, that country should be in a crisis. You are in the top 3, we're not, so we're in a crisis, yeah, we are. It's quite simple, isn't it?
As South Africa seeks a return to the glory years, politics will again have a part to play. Much of her rugby history centred on the exclusion of her black population. Today, it's the black majority who perhaps hold the key to South Africa's rugby future.
If there is sufficient support among the black community in the future, then who knows what South African rugby teams will be able to achieve. 40 million people. It's crucially dependent upon whether the two communities, black and white, can make it work together.